All right, let's get right into it. When you think about World War I, there's usually one single event that jumps to mind, right? But the real story? Well, it's so much deeper than that. It's the story of an entire continent that was basically a tinderbox just waiting for a spark long before any shots were fired. Today, we're going to dig into those real, deep-seated reasons.
So, that brings us to the big question. Was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand really enough to kick off a global war? I mean, it's what we all learn in school, but the truth is, it's a lot more complicated. That one moment, it was the trigger, for sure, but it wasn't the cause. Think of it as the final straw that broke the camel's back, but the camel was already carrying a mountain.
You know, a much better way to look at it is like this. Europe in 1914 was a giant powder keg. The whole place was just packed with explosive fuel. The assassination, that was just the match that lit the fuse. So the real question isn't about the match, it's about the fuel. What was this stuff, and how in the world did it all get there? Well, lucky for us, there's a really easy way to remember all that fuel. It's just one simple word, an acronym. M.A.I.N. This stands for militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. These four huge forces had been simmering for decades, and they're what made the Great War pretty much inevitable. So, let's break them down, one by one.
Okay, first up, we've got M for militarism. This is all about the glorification of military power and the core belief that a massive, powerful military was the #1 tool for any great nation.
Now, this isn't just about having an army for defense. No, this was a whole philosophy, a national obsession, really. It's the idea that your country's goals are best achieved through military might, and that diplomacy and talking things out, well, that takes a back seat to the threat of force.
And you could see this happening all over Europe. I mean, countries were pouring insane amounts of money into their armies and navies. They were using conscription to build massive armies, forcing millions of young men into uniform. And maybe most importantly, generals and military leaders started having a huge say in politics, always pushing for a more aggressive stance.
Probably the most famous example of this was the crazy arms race at sea between Britain and Germany. Britain had ruled the waves for centuries, but now Germany was building a massive navy to challenge them. This sparked this frantic competition to build bigger, faster, and more powerful battleships. These new, terrifying ships called dreadnoughts. Each one was basically a giant, floating symbol of power.
And this is maybe the most dangerous part of militarism. It totally changed how leaders thought. War was no longer seen as this horrible tragedy to be avoided at all costs. For a lot of them, it started to seem inevitable, and for some, even like a good thing, a way to prove their nation's strength once and for all.
All right, next up in M.A.I.N., we have A for alliances. So if militarism built up all the weapons, the alliance system is what created the two opposing teams, all ready to go to battle.
Now, on the surface, these alliances probably seemed like a pretty smart idea. It was kind of a you have my back and I'll have yours deal. The thinking was that it would create a balance of power, right? No single country would dare attack another, because they knew they'd have to fight all their friends too.
And by 1914, Europe was split right down the middle. On one side, you had the Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And on the other side was the Triple Entente, that was Great Britain, France, and Russia. A whole tangled web of promises tied all these nations together. But here's the thing. Instead of actually keeping the peace, the system created a tripwire, a tiny local conflict. Something that should have just been between, say, Austria-Hungary and Serbia, could now trigger this massive chain reaction, pulling country after country into the fight like a row of falling dominoes.
Okay, let's move on to I, imperialism. This was all about the intense, cutthroat competition for overseas empires, and it added this whole global layer of tension to what was already brewing in Europe. For decades, the big European powers had been in this frantic race to carve up Africa and Asia and claim the land for themselves. And this wasn't just about planting flags on a map. No, it was about power, it was about money, and it was about prestige.
See, these colonies were incredibly valuable. They provided the raw materials, like rubber, oil, and cotton, that were needed to power Europe's industrial factories. They were also brand new markets where you could sell all your finished goods. And let's be honest, having a huge empire was the ultimate status symbol. It was proof that your nation was a major player on the world stage. And this is where Germany comes back into the picture. Germany was a much younger country than Britain or France, so they felt like they'd totally missed out on the first big land grab.
They desperately wanted their own place in the sun, as they called it, and this created a lot of resentment and distrust, especially towards Britain and France, who already had these massive global empires.
And that brings us to the final, and maybe the most volatile ingredient in this whole explosive mix, N, for nationalism. This is that powerful, emotional force of intense pride and loyalty to your country or your ethnic group.
We're not just talking about simple patriotism here. This was something much more intense. It's the belief that your nation is superior to all others, and that its interests should come before everything else. It can be a powerful force for unity, but boy, can it also be incredibly destructive.
Nationalism really was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was a unifying force. It helped bring people together who shared a language and a culture to create new countries, like we saw with Germany and Italy. But on the other hand, it was a ticking time bomb inside huge multi-ethnic empires like Austria-Hungary, where you had all these different groups, Serbs, Croats, Czechs, Poles, who all dreamed of having their own independent nations.
And the absolute flashpoint for all this tension was a region called the Balkans. Serbian nationalists, in particular, dreamed of creating a greater Serbia that would unite all the Slavic peoples of the region. This dream was a direct threat to the Austro-Hungarian Empire next door, which, of course, ruled over millions of those very same Slavic people. It was right here that all the pressures in Europe came to a head.
So let's bring it all back together now. You have a continent just soaked in the fuel of M.A.I.N, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. The stage was perfectly set. All it needed was a spark. And that spark came when a Serbian nationalist assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
You can almost see it as a step-by-step process. First, militarism builds up the massive armies and the desire to use them. Then, the alliance system creates the two opposing teams, guaranteeing that any fight will be a big one. Imperialism raises the stakes, creating these global rivalries. And finally, nationalism provides that explosive fuse, ready to be lit.
The key takeaway here is that World War I didn't just happen out of the blue. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't caused by one single event. It was the tragic and, you could almost say predictable, result of decades of these powerful forces pushing Europe closer and closer to the edge of a cliff.
Which leaves us with one last, pretty chilling question to think about. If these M.A.I.N forces were so powerful and so deeply woven into the fabric of Europe, was there actually anything anyone could have done to stop the war? Or was the continent already on a path that it simply couldn't escape? It's something to really ponder.